Fantastic.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to our presentation on addressing explicit and implicit bias, microaggressions, and allyship. I'm Diana Otan from the SPAN Parent Advocacy Network. I'm joined by Lanisha Makel-Ridley and Johan Mora Valverde, who will be supporting during the webinar today, which will be recorded and placed on the New Jersey Council on Developmental Disabilities website. And we're doing this presentation on behalf of the New Jersey Council on Developmental Disabilities. Johan.
Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. For using closed captioning, you want to start by using CC. Click the caption button to go ahead and start. And for further instructions in Spanish, but you can follow this as well in English. Uso de subtítulos traducidos, to use translated subtitles. Los subtítulos deberían poder verse automáticamente, si no es así. If you can't see it automatically, then follow the next steps. Junto al botón Muestra subtítulos, haga clic en el botón de integración hacia arriba. Make sure when you click on subtitles, you are clicking translation 2, and you can see the following language if you are able to see the screen and the slide right now. And then select the language or selecciona traducir and click the language that you are comfortable in viewing or understanding for today's webinar. And if you do not see the language you're using, make sure you click more or haga clic en opción más to see the other languages that are available. Thank you.
Thanks, Johan. So today's webinar is one of a series that's intended for members of the New Jersey Council on Developmental Disabilities networks. So that includes council members, it includes members of the Regional Family Support Planning Councils, it includes self-advocates, it includes parents of and individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities in New Jersey. The webinar today introduces the concepts of explicit versus implicit bias, microaggressions, and allyship, and also provides strategies to combat bias and microaggressions and become an ally. So let's start off talking about bias, and we'll start off with explicit bias. Explicit bias or explicit stereotypes are the result of intentional, conscious, and controllable thoughts and beliefs. They're usually directed towards a group of people based on what is being perceived. So one explicit stereotype example would be that all adolescent girls like to play with dolls and makeup. The characteristics of explicit bias are that it's deliberate, conscious, it's easier for people to recognize in themselves if they have explicit bias, and it also often reflects social and personal values of an individual, of their community, of their upbringing, etc. And here's some examples. I'm skinny, so I must be anorexic. I'm a teenager, so I must be a troublemaker. I wear designer clothes, so I must be rich. I'm a girl, I have to wear pink. I'm not a virgin, so I must be easy. These are just all some examples of stereotypes. Implicit bias is more difficult to identify within ourselves. It's a positive or negative mental attitude towards a person, thing, or group that a person holds at an unconscious level. The characteristics are that it's typically very unconscious and involuntarily formed, and often becomes a habit with people. So if you look and see, explicit bias is generally expressed directly, while implicit bias is expressed indirectly. For explicit bias, we're generally aware of our biases, but we're usually unaware of our implicit biases. Explicit bias operates consciously compared to implicit bias that operates subconsciously. An example of implicit bias is I like whites more than Latinos, whereas an example of an implicit bias would be just sitting further away from a Latino than a white individual and not even knowing why you did it. Implicit social cognition, which is where we find cognitive bias, are thoughts and feelings that are outside of our conscious awareness and control. And yet, despite the fact that these implicit biases are typically outside of our conscious awareness and control, they have a significant impact on what we do. Implicit bias impacts the automatic nature of beliefs or stereotypes when they capture associations between certain social groups and their common stereotypes. For example, I'm Native American, and there is a stereotype about Native Americans that Native Americans are alcoholics. And so people who automatically have this belief, unconsciously have this belief about Native Americans being alcoholics, would behave differently towards Native Americans without even being aware of why this is happening. Implicit bias impacts the automatic nature of attitudes or preferences when they capture associations between social groups and common evaluations of them, even if those evaluations are absolutely incorrect and have no foundation in reality. Professionally implicit bias impacts the judgments that we form about individuals, patients, constituents, co-workers, situations and circumstances that are based on stereotypes. It also impacts how we interpret others' behavior. This is one reason why studies have found that teachers fear Black male students for engaging in the same behavior that they do not fear from white male students. And they're not even conscious that this is happening. They interpret that same behavior differently. Professionally implicit bias also impacts effectiveness and impact of interactions with patients, families, community members, co-workers, people that sit on groups with us. And the sad reality is that most of us are unaware of our own implicit biases. They are hidden. Implicit bias, including implicit racial bias, resides in our unconscious mind, the part of our brain that many researchers believe is beyond our direct control. Our implicit biases are also less egalitarian. So our unconscious attitudes are less egalitarian than what we explicitly think about race or gender or disability. And implicit biases are generally self-reinforcing. So our refusal to talk about and confront issues of race or stereotypes based on other characteristics reinforces that implicit bias. So why should we care? There are a lot of reasons why it's important for us to care about implicit biases and how the ones that we have and the ones that others have and how they impact us. Implicit bias can lead to prejudice and stereotyping, which leads to discrimination, which leads to inequality and justice, which then leads to negative symbolic attitudes, which then reinforces implicit bias. And so it's really a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's a circle that continues to reinforce negative impacts on those people for whom we hold implicit or unconscious biases. There's lots of different types of implicit biases. People have implicit biases based on disability, on gender and gender identification, race and ethnicity, language, age, religion, sexual orientation and preference, physical attributes, economic status, immigrant status, or status as an individual with limited English proficiency. So for example, there's research that shows that many people unconsciously believe that someone in the United States with limited English proficiency, in other words, who speaks a language other than English but is not fluent in English, is less intelligent than a person who speaks English. And there are many different implicit biases that go along with each of these types of categories of people against whom there are commonly held implicit biases. And I'm going to talk a little bit now about some of the implications. So implications for behavior of people. So implicit racial biases predict the amygdala activation, which is the fear response. So for example, Implicit racial bias would lead someone's amygdala, it's a part of the brain that is that controls the fear response, to become afraid of someone from a different race, even though there's no behavior or action on the part of that individual that would lead somebody logically to believe that they were in danger. Implicit racial biases also predict lower performance ratings. So supervisors giving lower performance ratings for individuals from a particular race, despite the fact that their actual performance is equal or even better than the performance of someone from a different racial background. Implicit racial biases also predict avoidance of the other group and more negative reactions and interactions with people from the racial group for whom we hold an implicit racial bias. In terms of gender biases, implicit gender biases predict bias ratings of job candidates. So again, a female candidate versus a male candidate in terms of their resume, past experience, even the discussion that happens in an interview will not necessarily lead to the same positive rating of a job candidate if someone holds an implicit gender bias. It also can be manifested in letters of recommendation. So for example, in letters of recommendation, men are more often described with superlatives and as having outstanding ability, whereas women are more often described as working hard. And it can also contribute to women's weaker association with math, even among math and science majors. Implicit biases also have significant impact on the social determinants of health. These are the things that are in our society that impact our health, even though they are not necessarily caused by the healthcare system. So our housing, our employment, our experience with the criminal justice system, our education, these all are activities and access points that definitely impact our health. And so they are part of social determinants of health. So implicit biases impact access to housing, affordable housing, redlining, loans and insurance. I still remember when we moved to New York City, and my husband and I did not have jobs, and we were moving at the same time as our best friends who were African American. And even though they were coming and already had jobs as college professors, we were shown housing in better neighborhoods, better housing, housing on one side of Flatbush Avenue, and they were shown housing that wasn't as good, the worst neighborhoods on the other side of Flatbush Avenue. Employment, so the impact of Black sounding names. So there's been research that's been done that shows when taking the same resume, but putting a quote unquote Black sounding name on the resume, and then having the same resume with a quote unquote white sounding name, and the person with the white sounding name is more likely to get an interview than the person with the quote unquote Black sounding name. And also the impact of criminal record on callbacks. In other words, you submit your resume or you do an interview and people find that you have a criminal record, and even if that criminal record has nothing to do with the job in question, it impacts the extent to which people are called back for a second interview or for a job. In the criminal justice system, we see racial profiling, we see jury bias, we see implicit bias showing up in sentencing recommendations, and also sentencing decisions by judges, where people of color, for example, for the same offense, same first offense, same severity of offense, are likely to get sentenced for a longer period of time, or they're likely to get sentenced to prison instead of not being sent to prison. And then in the education system, so we look at the impact of implicit biases on referrals to special education, placements in more segregated settings, the use of discipline, and even teacher expectations and behavior. And I think many people are familiar with the study that was done where teachers were told that certain children in their class were really, really smart and other children in their class were not really, really smart, but despite any evidence to the contrary, teachers went along with that expectation. Also, there's a lot of research that shows that teachers are less likely to call on students of color when they raise their hands, or they wait a less amount of time for a student of color to respond than they do for a white student. So there's lots of impacts of these implicit biases, and teachers are completely unaware of that behavior. There are also huge implicit biases impacts on healthcare. So if you look at race, Blacks have lower rates of cardiac surgeries, fewer hip and knee replacements, and fewer kidney and liver transplants, even for the same problems. Diabetic Blacks are more often amputated than diabetic whites. Blacks receive less pain medication for the same injuries and diseases than whites. And Blacks were more likely to be castrated as a treatment for prostate cancer than whites. In fact, a review of 600 studies looking at implicit biases in healthcare based on race found disparities in cancer treatment, receipt of children's medication, HIV treatment, diabetes management, cardiovascular treatment, pain management, clinical test referral rates, physician communication behaviors, placement on kidney transplant wait lists, physician perceptions, and amputations. And a review of 171 studies of the Veterans Affairs system found disparities in arthritis pain management, cancer treatment, diabetes, heart and vascular disease treatment, mental health and substance abuse treatment, and preventative care. And again, in all of these situations, if you would ask the people that were making different recommendations and providing different treatment based on race, whether they were making these decisions based on race, they all, or most of them, would have been unaware that their decisions were impacted by implicit bias. But it's not just race where we see the impact of biases. So in terms of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, about 30% of LGBTQ+ individuals postponed care when sick or injured, and even postponed preventive health care due to discrimination and disrespect by providers. And female to male transgender people were most likely to postpone care due to discrimination. About 20% of transgender people have been denied services by a doctor or other provider due to their gender. And not surprisingly, racial and ethnic minority transgender people were more likely to be denied services. And gay parents also report negative experiences in their children's health care due to their sexuality. In other words, the gay parent's sexuality is actually impacting their children's health care. So what can we do to try to de-bias or unbias ourselves and work with others to engage in this process of getting rid of these implicit biases about which we are generally not familiar? So there's three main approaches. One, and we're going to go into more detail about all of these. One is education, so awareness and mindfulness. Another is exposure, so contact with people who are in that group of people against whom we have implicit bias, positive exemplars and changes in the environment, and our approach, so higher level processing, reduced cognitive load, checklists, procedural organizational changes. These are all important steps that we can take to de-bias, to get rid of implicit biases. So we have a two-strategy solution. So our unconscious biases lead to judgment and behavior. So we can consciously override our biases, and we can also change our implicit associations. And we're going to talk about both of these strategies: consciously overriding our implicit biases and changing our implicit associations. So to override our unconscious bias, the first thing is we have to be motivated to control our bias. And we have to be aware of the potential for bias. And we have to take the time to consider individual characteristics and avoid stereotyped evaluations of individuals based on our unconscious bias. But one of the best pieces of news is that motivation to be fair makes a big difference. motivation to be fair has a significant impact on our expressions of bias. Our implicit biases are malleable and they can be changed when we are pushed to change by specific motivations, including the motivation to be fair and the motivation to not appear prejudiced, and also to avoid interracial or conflict between ourselves and other groups, as well as by situational factors. But motivation requires that we know that there is an issue. So we have to recognize our implicit biases and responses. So for example, one way is to take the implicit association test, which we'll talk about a little bit later, that can help us identify some of our implicit biases about which we may not be aware. Implicit biases can also be changed when people invest the effort to practice specific strategies to avoid stereotypes or prejudicial responses. It can also be changed by changing the social context that we inhabit. With the longer the period of exposure to people, counter stereotypes, people who are different from our implicit bias, the greater the decrease in stereotypes. So let's talk a little bit about the change process. So one idea, one important thing to do is to use checklists. So using checklists at key decision points can encourage less biased decisions by providing an objective framework to assess our thinking. For example, in a hiring decision, it's useful to agree beforehand to the basic merit criteria. Are we looking for book smarts? Are we looking for street smarts? Are we looking for educational experience or lived experience? This helps assure that we pay less attention to biased characteristics that may be influencing our decision making. Using explicit checklists that we develop and agree to use beforehand can also limit the tendency, the implicit tendency, the unconscious tendency to remake the criteria to fit the in-group favoritism and preferred candidates. So checklists and explicit predetermined criteria are both really good approaches that can help us debias. Another is to write instead of discussing off the cuff. One thing that happens when you take the time to write things instead of just discussing them off the cuff is that you give yourself more time. And implicit bias can be limited by allowing more time to consider decisions. This also is something that decreases our cognitive load. A cognitive load is the amount and complexity of information that has to be processed in any given time frame. So by writing things, instead of just discussing them off the cuff, we give ourselves more time to process the information. We give ourselves more time to make sure that we are avoiding our implicit biases. Another approach to debiasing is to use procedural changes to disrupt the link between implicit bias and discriminatory behavior through changed procedures. So for example, if we add a step in the procedure of interviewing a candidate for a position, and that additional step is to have a conversation with a representative from a group that is one of the groups against whom we may have implicit bias, so that we talk through the possible negative impact of our implicit biases, that's a procedural change that could help disrupt the negative implications of our implicit biases. Similarly, adding a level of accountability in the process debiases decisional outcomes. So if we think that we are being monitored or may have to explain our decisions, we are more motivated to act in an unbiased or debiased way. But it's important that we are accountable to a superior who offers a clear, unbiased approach and who is committed to debiasing and disrupting implicit bias decision making. It's also important that accountability be established so that there's less silence in the face of discrimination. Leadership has a critical responsibility to do this, to speak out, but we all share this responsibility. Another important approach to debiasing is to focus on micro messaging, where small messages are sent, typically without conscious thought or intent. These messages may be micro affirmations or micro inequities or even microaggressions, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. To understand micro messaging, think about the pictures that hang in your office or the graphics that you use when you're sending out information to people about an upcoming meeting. When the statue of the women suffragettes joined the many male statues in the Capitol Rotunda, Senator Olympia Snowe at the time commented that her work environment had significantly improved just because for once, finally, there was a woman, a statue of a woman leader in that Capitol Rotunda. You can also think about this example. An associate of color shares an idea and no one responds. But when a white colleague shares an idea, people respond. Or senior leadership is seen repeatedly chatting in the hallways with certain staff, white staff, straight staff, staff without disabilities, younger staff, male staff, but not others. And of course, those small messages can be micro-affirming to the majority population, but micro inequity for those populations that generally face prejudice, discrimination, and bias. And these small messages can accumulate, and they accumulate very easily. So it's very important that we pay attention to those small messages. Now, we can also work to change our unconscious bias. And the two main ways we do that are through education and through exposure. In education, we have to make sure that we are aware and mindful. So for example, we can take the implicit association test, we look at the results and consider what does that mean for the implicit biases that we have that we haven't been aware of in the past. And then we have to be aware and remain mindful. Intuition and implicit responsible, but some decisions require a more explicit kind of thinking, a stare, not a blink. In other words, making a decision, slowing down our decision-making process, consulting with others, considering our implicit biases, considering the potential impact of our implicit biases on our decisions, on our approach, on our behavior, on our thinking. Another important approach is exposure. So making contact with positive, diverse colleagues and exemplars and practice taking the other perspective. These all contribute to decreasing implicitly biased response. The more that people interact with individuals that are from the group for whom they hold an implicit bias, and then learn the positive attributes of those individuals, the more they interact with those individuals, the more they talk to those individuals about their experiences and their thinking. These are all ways that we can debias our implicit bias. Another thing to think about is practicing cultural reciprocity. Understanding that cultures have different ways of responding to relationships, parenting, conflict, help-seeking behaviors, etc. And that our cultural backgrounds and our cultural experiences shape our status, our relationships, and our social behaviors, including with regard to conflict resolution. Thinking about cultures where justice for the individual is the most important thing, which is the common majority opinion in the United States, versus group harmony. So many other cultures from many other countries, group harmony is more important than individual justice. And even the willingness to question authority, where in the United States, we're all taught to advocate and question authority, whereas in many other cultures, questioning authority is not as popular or not, or may actually lead to people being negatively reprimanded by others in their group. And also recognizing that people communicate and process information differently. So rational versus intuitive, linear, that straight line, beginning, the middle, the end, versus a circular reasoning. Abstract versus concrete, and time-bound versus not time-bound. For example, as a Cajun, in the place where I'm from, in Bayou Lafourche, time is not a concept that goes by a clock. And so, but I had to learn. I learned in school, I learned in college, I learned in law school, to be very time bound. You show up for a court hearing late and you're in deep trouble. But that was a cultural misfit for me, because in my culture of origin, time did not have the same meaning that it has in our overall US society. But of course, cultural reciprocity is a process, not an outcome. We have to develop reciprocal relationships of trust. We have to learn about others and also share about ourselves. Why should we expect someone to share with us if we're not willing to share about ourselves? We have to ask people what will work for them. Listen with the heart, for the heart, and share your heart. Do unto others as they would have you do unto them, as opposed to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. For example, in some cultures, hugging is not part of their cultural experience, except for people who they know very, very well. Whereas for me, Cajuns hug all the time. So I can't go and hug people because I want people to hug me. I have to do unto others as they would have me do unto them. And then also seek first to understand and then to be understood. Some other important strategies to address implicit bias: become as aware as possible of our individual perceptions and stereotypes and their impact on our decision making. Engage in opportunities to learn more about cultures that are different from ours, and particularly those cultures about whom we may have implicit biases, or about whom we may hold stereotypes. Get to know your colleagues, your patients, your constituents, your coworkers, people who are on your regional family support planning council and their backgrounds, and suspend those negative judgments, that rush to judgment that happens as a result of implicit bias. Recognize that diversity is real, dynamic, and legitimate, and that there is more than one way to do things. And engage in courageous conversations to increase our knowledge and address those negative perceptions, stereotypes, and attitudes. Muslims are not all terrorists. My hair is real. I'll marry whoever I want. I'm not a color. We're not all Mexican. Not all Asians are studious. I am not white trash. These are examples of people standing up to those stereotypes. So some important resources are on implicit bias. There's Harvard has this implicit bias test, this Project Implicit, to assess your implicit bias. And I've also included a link to a training to address implicit bias. The first links is to help you assess your own implicit bias and become more aware of your influence of bias that influences your attitudes and behavior. And the second is training that you can take. And this is just showing you the Project Implicit website. So you can find out your implicit associations about race, gender, sexual orientation, disability, etc. And it's free. So let's talk a little bit more about microaggressions. So we introduced the idea of microaggressions when we were talking about some of those everyday things, like the pictures in your office or the graphics that you use when you send out information about upcoming meetings. Microaggressions are subtle verbal or nonverbal insults or denigrating messages that are communicated towards a marginalized person. That is, someone who experiences discrimination, prejudice, someone who doesn't have as much power in our society. So a person of color, a person with a disability, a person who is LGBTQ+, a woman in a man's profession, etc. often by somebody who may be well-intentioned but unaware of the impact the words or actions have on that marginalized person. And I gave you a link to a really nice document that explains microaggressions. And there's three main types of microaggressions. So there's microassaults. Those are overt forms of discrimination in which people behave in discriminatory ways. They may think that their actions aren't noticed or not harmful. So for example, when someone says, "That's so gay," to connote that something is weird, the person is aware of the words that they choose, but they may not realize that using that language is offensive. Another is a micro insult. And that's a statement or behavior in which individuals unconsciously communicate discriminatory messages to members of target groups. For example, a person might tell an Asian American, "Oh, you speak good English," implying that Asian Americans don't speak good English. And this, of course, can be especially upsetting to Asian Americans who only speak English. Of course, that demonstrates right there an implicit bias, believing that anybody who's Asian American doesn't speak English. And then micro invalidations. And micro invalidations are verbal statements that deny, negate, or undermine the realities of members of target groups. For example, when a person tells a person of color that racism doesn't exist, that person is invalidating and denying the person of color's racial reality. So some examples of common microaggressions are, "Where are you really from?" Assuming that a person who looks different from you must be from some other country or someplace else. "What are you?" "You are so articulate," to a person from a particular racial or ethnic background. "When I look at you, I don't see color." Or, "Why are you so loud?" Or, "Why are you so quiet?" So how can we repair these microaggressions? So I'm going to talk a little bit about repairing our own microaggressions, as well as how can we address the microaggressions that are committed by others that we see or hear. So CALM is one microaggression repair tool that you can use if you find that you have committed a microaggression. First is center the other person. Really focus on the other person. Please share what's on your mind. I'm listening. If there's anything on your mind you would like to share, I'd appreciate hearing it whenever you are ready. The A stands for acknowledge impact over intent. You may not have intended harm, but that doesn't matter if you've actually had the impact of harm. So I want to acknowledge that my words or actions might have had a harmful effect on you. Listen and validate their feelings, and then make it right. Apologize and ask how you can make it right. But it's also important that we stand up and be heard when we hear or see microaggressions of others, from others. So if we've heard or seen a microaggression against someone else, we can restate or paraphrase to make sure that we heard it right. Ask for clarification or more information. Acknowledge the feelings behind the statement or action. Separate intent from impact. Don't assume that they had a negative intent. Share your own process and your own thinking. State your values of inclusivity and your disapproval of what you saw or heard. "I find that offensive and I don't agree with it. Please don't make those types of comments." You can challenge the stereotype and appeal to their values and principles of inclusivity. Promote empathy and remind them of the rules or policies. So for example, there are rules against discrimination. There are rules against prejudice. There are rules against bullying or taking negative action based on the protected characteristics of race, ethnicity, LGBTQ+ status, gender, etc. And remember, we said earlier that making sure people understand the rules or the policies is an important part of both avoiding implicit bias, but also addressing and preventing microaggressions. So here are some great microaggression resources. This is from, there's actual whole module 4 on implicit bias and microaggressions that I think is really excellent. There's also a piece by Tiffany Jana and Michael Barron on subtle acts of exclusion, how to understand, identify, and stop microaggressions. And dismantling everyday discrimination, microaggressions towards LGBTQ people by Kevin Leo Yabut Nadal. So finally, we're going to talk a little bit about allyship. So what is allyship? It's when a person of relative privilege works in solidarity and partnership with a marginalized group of people to help take down the systems that challenge that group's basic rights, equal access, and ability to thrive in our society. And when you respond to microaggressions that you have heard from others, that's one of the things you can do to be an ally. So some of the things to do, I mean, it's important to listen, to learn, and to take action and advocate. And let's go into a little bit more detail. So when you practice allyship, you have to acknowledge your own privilege. So I'm the first person in my family to go to college. Not only did I go to college, I went to law school. Regardless of how I grew up, the poverty I grew up, the discrimination I may have faced as a girl or as an Indigenous person, I have tremendous privilege as a person who has a law school degree, and I have to acknowledge that privilege. We have to recognize that we are not the expert on another person or group's lived experience. We need to listen to and take direction from those with lived experiences of marginalization and oppression, as well as resistance and organizing. We have to put in the work, including educating ourselves about systems of oppression and their impacts. For example, it's important to know, as we addressed in this webinar earlier, what some of the negative implications of implicit bias can be on the real lives of people that face oppression, discrimination, and prejudice. We also can amplify the voices of those with lived experience that is different from our own, and call out explicit or implicit bias, microaggressions, etc., when we hear and see them. And then finally, be accountable for our mistakes, accept our criticism, understand and recognize that it might not have been our intent, but if that was our impact, we still have to accept that criticism and be accountable for our mistakes. And then there's a great, 2 really good online trainings about allyship. One is actually from linkedin.com, which has a lot of learning modules, and there's some good modules around allyship. And also nonprofitready.org has a series of free diversity, equity, and inclusion courses that include courses on allyship. And I really recommend both of these sets of resources to you for further information about allyship. We've just barely, touched the surface of these topics today. So the last thing I want to talk about is the council and its networks as equity advocates. What can the council do to advocate for increased advocacy and equity from government agencies, service providers, other family organizations, and other nonprofits? Well, the council can be a leader. It can educate agencies, providers, individuals, and families on the importance of equity and allyship and the dangers of implicit and explicit bias and microaggressions, and advocate with individuals and families to ensure that agencies make needed changes. And in fact, we will be doing a webinar that will also be available on the council website on advocating with and on behalf of diverse individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families. Also building the council's organizational capacity to reach and support diverse individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families. Engage diverse families as council members, staff, and as volunteers. Build coalitions and partner with diverse community-based organizations. And other types of activities that the council can engage in to make sure that they are being a leader on behalf of equity. And so at this point, I'm going to see if anybody has any questions or comments about our presentation today. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Thanks, Kyoko. All right. Thank you very much for your participation. This webinar and the resources will be housed on a page of the Council on Developmental Disabilities focused on diversity, equity, inclusion, cultural competence, and linguistic responsiveness, which we are in the process of creating. And so you'll be able to access this information, including the recording, the PowerPoint, and additional resources. Thanks very much for joining.